Thank you, Anna, for introducing this important evening of Create. And I begin, as ever, by acknowledging the beautiful Gadigal land of the Eora Nation that I'm coming to you from this evening. And I thank most sincerely and acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging for the years and millennia of learning and knowledge that has been gifted to us. And it's a great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Dr. Claire Coleman, who comes to us this evening. She's actually at the University of Sydney this evening, but coming to us as a visitor from the University of Waikato. Claire has a PhD that examined the critical frameworks for use in process drama. She's a very thoughtful practitioner. She has a lot of experience as a primary teacher. She has an interest in dance and musical theatre. And she's been working with us for the last week and a half and observing and engaging in our creative practices and the way we integrate our drama-rich strategies into our ordinary practice. So I welcome you all most sincerely and thank you for joining us this evening. And thank you, Claire, very much for your generosity in offering to be with us this evening. I'm sure we will all benefit enormously from what you are going to share with us. And I do apologise at the outset for the many animals that you will see gracing my page. It is a bit of a Noah's Ark at my house. Claire, welcome.
Thank you. All right, so Anna, I'll just get going, shall I? I see that's what I'm going to do. All right, bear with me, everyone. I'm just going
all yours.
to
you can share your slides from where you are.
and things. Okay, all right. Well, hang on, I have to do this first. All right. Is everyone good and everyone can see and everyone can hear? Kia ora, yes. Good evening, everybody. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, nā mihi ao ke te maunga o mangawhao, ko Waikato te awa, ko England te whenua o oku te puna, ko Claire Coleman toku ingoa, no reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. So as Alison so graciously introduced me, my name is Claire. I'm from the University of Waikato, and that was my introduction in Te Reo Māori, just to acknowledge the mountain in Mangawhao that I associate with, affinity with, Waikato River, originally born in England, and just welcoming you all to this evening. I also want to begin with a karakia. Typically when we are engaging in a gathering of any kind, we often will start with a waiata or a karakia to sort of bring us together in this shared space. This particular karakia is actually the karakia of my children's school, and I really enjoy it because I think it's very friendly. If you do want to join in with me, you may, otherwise just please read. Ha ki roto, ha ki waho, kia tau te Māori e kokere ne, I ngā pikine, ngā heke, ko te rangimarie, taku e rapune, tihei Māori ora. So we all take a breath and share together. All right, so I'm going to be talking this evening about the critical process drama framework that kind of evolved from my doctoral work some time ago now. And I'm basically going to break this into sort of three segments. I'm going to give you the origin story, where did it come from. I'm going to go into the elements of the framework and kind of talk about them in a bit more detail. And then I'm going to talk to what I've been doing over the last few weeks in terms of playing with the framework, both in Aotearoa and more recently over the last week and a half here in Sydney, and just kind of how that's going. And that's very much exploratory and kind of, you know, finding my way at the moment. So I'll just kind of relate what I've been up to and how this is working in practice and in praxis. And I'm hopeful that will be of interest to you. But first I will start with a little bit of drama. The setting, a dusty old repurposed classroom, which serves as a drama room. Heavy curtains with holes in them block out most of the light, and the teacher wanders around the group in bare feet. Wow, those were some pretty intense moments we explored today, weren't there? We have just created another story from the other side of the wall. I wonder if anyone has anyone else they'd like to say about the work we did today. Silence. Oh, crap, she wants us to say something. I wonder what motivates us to do something when we know it is wrong. Yep, we need to say something about doing the wrong thing. I'm not sure I thought it was the wrong thing. I just went along with it. So I wrote that little moment this evening because I think it sort of speaks to the origin of this framework for me, which was about sometimes being in process drama works or working in drama frames and feeling as a participant that I was sort of going along with things, and we're all asked to reflect at the end and think about what we learned and share our great moments, and not necessarily feeling like I had that great epiphany moment that it seems the teacher wanted me to have had, and being curious to know why I was feeling disconnected from the material, or why I had gone along with things when I actually wanted to challenge them or question them. And yeah, kind of reaching what I often describe as your sort of kumbaya moment, often in a process drama work, where you have this lovely experience, but then, we sort of, often I feel like we might just talk it to death, and it kind of loses something for me. So that's one of the things that I think provoked my thinking in this area. And then the doctoral study itself came out of the master's study that I did some million years ago, where I worked with some Pacific Island boys in South Auckland, and we were doing the Year 9 boys, and we were doing a process work. I was looking at engagement. We were doing a process work, and after the first day, on the first hour, I sort of packing up chairs with one of the students, and I said, "Oh, how did you find that?" And he said, "Oh, it was nice to pretend to be smart." And this is a statement that I have said a bunch of times in various places, and it always makes me kind of give me goosebumps, because it was so interesting to me that this young person felt that way. I wanted to know, why does he feel the need that pretending was the avenue through which he was able to be smart? Why didn't he identify himself as being smart? He was offering all these things in role. What was role giving to him? And how had he internalized this idea of himself, as not being smart? And that sort of drew me to Freire and notions of critical pedagogy, and that whole kind of critical discourse around thinking around ideologies, and how we internalize all of this kind of structural oppression and structural definition of the way the world works and where everyone's position in the world is, and how we should behave and should be, and normalize that sort of thing. And drama struck me as a place in which we can be otherwise, and we can do other things, and therefore I thought perhaps there was something in that to be explored. So the title of the thesis was Dancing Through the Fourth Wall. There was a whole dance metaphor in the PhD. So primarily because I think process drama and critical pedagogy are both quite fluid ways of working. They're very contextual. They are happening in action and are very responsive, but much like I think of dancing, rather than sort of a set prescribed set of rules or a lesson plan. So that metaphor attempted to capture that, and essentially looked at, okay, if I've got an inkling about process drama works that I've done, and I've got an inkling about this critical pedagogy stuff, let's see whether or not, if we put those things together, what might be the opportunities, or where are the challenges to those things. So I chose to use, did a couple of case studies, and I underpin that with, much as I've just said, those two things are quite fluid and contextual. I did have to come up with some parameters for it. So as you can see here, these were sort of my guiding principles around what I thought came underneath critical pedagogy, and some guiding principles under process drama as an exploratory improvisational form of drama that we undertake for the students' own learnings, rather than for any kind of performative way. So I thought they had a shared kind of philosophy in terms of a vision of education as being concerned with the abilities of the individual to recognize and create that own world. And I'm hopeful you can see, if looking just across these two lists, at some opportunities for partnership. Both of them are concerned with educational justice and education for the benefit of the participants, taking students or participants' interests as a start point and locating the teacher in kind of a collaborative dialogic space with the participants who are all in that mix, and shifting and challenging the sort of hierarchies. But there were some issues in both of these that I thought also might benefit from playing across with the two. So critical pedagogy for me is still quite a dense, theoretical, rational leaning, sort of Western, underpinned by a very Western political way of thinking. And it's taught very much still in universities in this kind of didactic way that I'm doing right now. So, very similar still to other subjects, in some ways very much in opposition to the way that critical pedagogy is conceptualized as being, collaborative and contextual and working together and thinking about working in circles and as a fluid kind of thing. And then process drama for me had also has made some quite large claims about its transformational capacity for students. But I was questioning in places that I had experienced it, as I alluded to in my short scene, where I had felt, it was still serving a curriculum, it was still serving a particular ideology, the teacher was still very much in control of things, and potentially it could be just, reinforcing a status quo or just being a window dressing for the curriculum. So these were the things that I, sort of problematized across. So I did these case studies in, one was document analysis around the Seal Wife, a well-known workshop from the 90s, and one was a study of a Mantle of the Expert piece, a contemporary piece that was being conducted in Hamilton, New Zealand, Karakia in Waikato, New Zealand. So Mantle of the Expert is probably in New Zealand and certainly in the UK one of the more kind of formalized and I guess popular forms of process drama, tends often to link into curriculum things. And that was the two different case studies there. I won't get into the weeds of that too much. So I had the two case studies that sort of iteratively woven and connected with each other. I looked at the Seal Wife document stuff first, and then took kind of my musings and thinkings and themes that had developed from that and considered them when I moved into the second case study. And one of the things I did was use this technique I termed rewriting and role, where because of the nature of the document study, the Seal Wife document analysis, there was just a lot of material around the workshop, and I was struggling to make sense of it. So I wrote myself into the workshop as a fictional character, creating a fictional character called Caitlin Anderson, and who attended that workshop and wrote kind of a diary as a way of generating and synthesizing the data that I already had from those documents. And that allowed me as well to ask lots of questions and to keep problematizing and not sort of coming to any fixed things. And then I reused that in the second case study as an analysis mechanism. So I rewrote into role to analyze my observations of the Mantle of the Expert, again using Caitlin, although some 25 years on, and then a satirical character in critical pedagogy, Bernard, and then me in kind of shadow role. And I thought I would show you a little clip of that because it will give you a sense of some of the debates around the framework, so that when I go into talking about that, I'm hopeful that will make sense. Plus, it's fun to show you a nice video. Please enjoy.
I have been confused since the start of the moat about the lack of delineation between the real and the fictional. How can participants operate with one foot in the real world and one in the imagined world if they can't tell the difference? During this moat, the two frames have continually merged, with no reflection or critical analysis being paid to either. Ironically, And likely as a result of this uncertainty, authority figures are sought out by the students like lighthouses in a storm.
The capacity for engaging simultaneously within two worlds is a fundamental benefit of process drama. This space of metaxis is a key ingredient of process drama for enabling considered reflection, which leads to the potential for change.
Warning the company that a client is quite important and you aren't to mess with them serves as a textbook example of the dehumanizing effects of capitalism. The authority and superiority of the client affirmed. The message to ARS is be afraid.
Well, this fear seems somewhat justified. However, as the delegates posed several tricky questions to the company, they asked about budgets and technical specifications, none of which the group contemplated in the drama.
Perhaps, Caitlin, moats don't want to admit their capitalist origins. Why wasn't money a factor before? Is it because money is a dirty word in moat or drama education? The capitalist ethic has been happily structured into the structures and mechanisms of moats, and yet is conspicuously missing from the design process. Would the preoccupation with money be too unseemly for the allegedly neutral and altruistic goals of education and curriculum?
Well, this strikes me as unusual, given the concept of ARS as a top-notch firm. It seems inexplicable these issues weren't considered earlier.
Claire, you seem in deep thought. What's your take on the company's presentation?
This abstract for me highlights a discrepancy between the social constructs that the moat replicates and the emancipatory fiction it advocates. I mean, during the presentation, the class, they sit quietly and echo customary classroom behavior. The company explains in detail the significance of the tank design and how their knowledge of shark habits and food sources and all that contributed to those designs. They continue to comply as employees of the big corporation, reducing the tension to a stifled gasp and whisper. And finally, I was again struck by the tacit reminder of that corporate etiquette. The company formally thanks the delegates.
Is the purpose of moat to teach manners and respect, the metaphorical talisman of the ruling classes? Conformity is good. Take your lumps with a smile, and don't forget to say thank you as corporate interests steal your soul.
Oh gosh, now I'm going to play the video again. Sorry, team. Okay, so yeah, just to be clear about that. So I wrote, so that we staged that little film, and I thank Derek and Gaynor and David for their participation. So I wrote the three characters, and the way that I staged that in the thesis was to have it written as a monograph of those three characters in debate, and then obviously we were able to kind of use it in a small staging via a Zoom meeting, and the idea being there that hopefully the reader or the viewer of that is kind of the fourth voice in there, joining in and seeing some of those debates and contradictions and questions, I guess, between our kind of critical pedagogy scholar, our drama scholar, and then, as I say, me in sort of a shadow role as well. So these were the things that kind of came out of those two studies that got me, that led into the creation of the framework. So in the Seal Wife drama, there was very much a kind of fixed ending to the pretext. I should say that workshop was run as a demonstration of process dramas, run by Cecily O'Neill. So it was very much supposed to be a teaching kind of workshop, 2 days around this Seal Wife story, but it did have the pretext itself had a kind of a definite ending to it. There was this focus on the Seal Wife as more of an object for other people to explore. So she didn't have any agency really of her own. It was about responses to the Seal Wife, and the teacher, when running or the facilitator of that workshop, was largely outside of the drama. So there wasn't any teacher enrolled. The teacher didn't get, or there was a little bit, but not a great deal. And then I guess the differential in that workshop too between Cecily, who was running the workshop, being quite an authority figure very authority figure in process drama, and the participants kind of how would they engage with that given the power discrepancy. And yeah, and some comment too in the documents around that workshop that there was very much an agenda around the idea of what it meant to be a mother, and that this sort of very much a kind of patriarchal drive towards being a good mother. And then in the mantle, there was very much a curriculum objective to what the students were learning about, which was about sharks, and having this kind of company that built augmented reality so they could get these sharks to breed in captivity. There was still an emphasis from the facilitator on what real or appropriate behaviours were for some of the company, for some of the students in role. There was very much the corporate trappings of having meetings and somebody taking the minutes and talking to the secretary. This idea again around the sort of shark farming that they were working towards a kind of company's aim. The space of the body was really interesting. Lots of the students in that particular drama resisted very much their kind of blanket role as being designers, and they wanted to be bodyguards, and they really enjoyed all the active moments of the process work. The teacher was in role, but really struggled to stay, the students kept trying to push them back into being the teacher and the authority. So it was quite hard to tell at times when they were in role and when they were being the teacher. It looked very similar. And then there was this kind of idea too that everything was performative. So everything was going to be given to a presentation. Everything that they created in the drama was going to be seen by someone. So, there was this kind of sense of accountability in that drama work. So that led me to, I guess, the framework, which is what are the elements that need to be thought about, need to be considered, and kind of need to operate around the central pretext of your process if you're trying to aim to make your work critical and trying to explicitly link the critical pedagogy and the drama work together. And so I had this kind of image of a maypole. So the pretext is the center point of your maypole. These are the 6 different ribbons around the A, which all began with A. So they formed a nice acronym of AHA. And so I'm going to go through each of these elements now, but rather than thinking them as a linear thing, I want you to think of them as different kind of weaving ribbons. So, that they fold over and up and under each other. So it's not sort of a hierarchical list. I'm just reading them in a list as they are because I have to do it, but that you think of these things working together and ebbing and flowing at different times, different things are leading, I guess, or different things are on the top of the maypole, on the top of the pattern, and that they form a kind of complex web pattern rather than kind of a straight line. So agency. So the idea of agency is really important to the framework, and that was kind of evident to me through, particularly the mantle, was this idea that adult behaviours were seemingly considered more valid, and this idea of adultism, or as John Bell would talk it, favouring adults over children and denying sort of children's experiences and children's humanity in favour of kind of indoctrinating them to being in the adult world. So, for example, in the moat, students had said, "Oh, I've learned how boring it is to be an adult." Whereas Freire would suggest that children are human beings and recognises them as human beings, and that they are capable of participating as active citizens regardless of age. And I would suggest that, a child's ability to be completely engrossed and holistically engaged puts them in some ways in a better place to critically imagine. And they haven't had, I guess, the years and years of kind of being in an ideological structure to sort of have to adhere to a particular behaviour. They might rely more on their sensed understandings and instinctively respond and experience the world with a quality that, that engages them in action immediately. So I think in some of these cases that I'm talking about, the agency occurred, in spite of rather than because of the drama. But those moments of rebellion that some of them had, like the students wanting to be bodyguards, was, kind of demonstrated some of the clues, I think, about what they found satisfying and what was interesting to them. So what does this, I guess, mean? So I think it means valuing the voice of the child as as a voice, as a genuine thing, and not disregarding or relegating it just because it doesn't have the terminology, it doesn't sound like our discourse as adults, and then really actively listening, not only to, and I'm not talking necessarily about words either, I just mean communications, not only what is being communicated, but what isn't from those young people, and a willingness to shift direction away from the plan and allow the participants to have agency to seize it rather than just to be allowed that agency within kind of the drama frame. It might upend your entire plan as a teacher or what you had in your head, but that needs to be okay. And I think it's important to consider why did they want to go in a different direction, or why did they resist what you were inviting them to do? And so part of that is the teacher trying to actively resist being positioned as the teacher, as the authority, and really developing that relational space to engage the participants as colleagues. So, you know, that kind of that idea of where we talk about authentic dialogue needs to be really deeply considered, not only in what is said or how it's said, but even in the setup and the space that you provide for that. So while I would advocate for moving in and out of role very often to ensure you don't get bedded into things, I think it's important to think about the agency that participants have when you're working in a critical process frame, not only in the drama, but outside of it too, in terms of their engagement with the drama. So it's not sort of like, oh, you're really agentic, we'll let you have agency in this little square, but then outside of it, you know, we're back to kind of not having agency. Ambiguity. So I think ambiguity is really important, and I would consider ambiguity as a sort of welcome uncertainty and this resistance to endings or boundaries, and the kind of linearity and a willingness really to entice and include and play. So evocative, provocative kind of things. And if you think of drama as a constantly relational interaction, it's always really engaging in the ambiguous, because what we communicate might be received differently, and then what they communicate back, you know, might not be what was intended. It's always in the kind of relational space. So I think you want to think about the drama work as not being, is going back into kind of episodic structures. So not so much a linear narrative. Have the time to replay, re-examine. And if you think about Brecht's technique around defamiliarizing concepts of reality and inciting questions and inviting resistance. So we know this in schools, often this sort of certainty and this fixed endings is very much privileged, and that kind of reinforces a sort of cultural imperialism, accepting particular types of knowledges and marginalizing other kinds. So this is where I think a critical drama could provide a rigorous, reflective and embodied experience that can cross different borders. So what does that mean? Maintaining that ambiguous exploratory stance, resisting providing the answers or shutting things down, you know. I think it's as a critical form, and I've literally just thinking this yesterday when I was working in this, to me what's most interesting is what are the questions that the participants ask, or even the questions that I might be motivated to ask as a facilitator. And as I said to Alison the other day, what resonances the drama has within each individual in many ways and how it connects to them is not my business. If we think of art as being a very personal thing, that's, you know, related to how someone views it with their experiences, it is going to provoke different things in different people at different times. And the idea with the drama is not to kind of have a nice couple of hour workshop where we all get to a lovely place of final certainty and coziness and go home and have a cup of tea. I'm more interested in a work that will follow them home and will pop up for them when they least expect it in terms of finding a resonance. The aesthetic. So I think certainly in Mantle of the Expert, one of the critiques that has been made, not just by me, of some people's practice, not all, of course, is a loss of aesthetic and needing to and a kind of, you know, it's inquiry, but with some different terms and some different, you know, a name badge and a slightly shifted thing. I think the aesthetic is actually really important to to have the facilitator use theatrical skills to add productive and aesthetic tensions to the drama, and to have a kind of aesthetic sensibility, as Julie Dunn would say, and as Robin Yu would say, that kind of the importance around the aesthetic, creating a kind of a specific, allowing for a particular kind of knowing and experience that can go through the body, through the feeling, and through things that we can't necessarily articulate in a sort of rational, logical way. I think the process needs to have artistry. And if we think about, Henry Giroux talks about the alliance between the arts and critical pedagogy, as the arts providing a broader range of mechanisms and skills and tools to perceive and create the world. I think that the arts part is really important. So that kind of alliance between education and artists is really important, and teacher artistry is vital. So I think, you know, in terms of what that means, it means using the drama of the thing. So it's, as I said, not inquiry, just with a few new words attached to it, but making sure that you think about the space, and you think about the mood, and you think about the focus and all of those drama elements, and then other art forms as well. What is the music that you can draw into this, or the lighting, or the way that you relate in the space, and what's being created there, and giving participants the opportunity to really work in those mechanisms and those modes as well, to communicate their ideas. Right, where am I? Okay, number 4, agitation. So the tension aspect of drama, of course, vitally important. Oops. Yeah, I think that the tension is really crucial, and as ever in drama, because in both in the examples I talked about in the thesis, there was still a kind of lack of driving force. And I think that as a pedagogy of questioning, a critical pedagogy really thrives on that kind of debate and that reconsideration of knowledge, and that problematizing and thinking about multiple perspectives and contexts. You think about Freire's use of problem posing. There has got to be a definite problem. There's got to be a definite trouble. And some of my concern a little bit in terms of process and use of blanket role too might be that there's this sort of compliance in the community, that we're all in this together, so then we'll all agree together. And I think you need to think about ways to break that, so that participants do feel like they can disagree, and that's going to be something they can do, that they can play in with the trouble, and release the participants from the kind of confines of the everyday. And I think moving between the imagined and the real world can also allow them to kind of consider them in juxtaposition, and the tension between those two things. So I think it's that thing around, the agitation can unveil kind of the taken for granted bits about reality and welcome our kind of creativity. And that sort of disruption. So I think about how to break from that compliance, not keeping people in blanket roles for too long, giving them space to trouble the identities and perspectives they're playing with, both in role and out of role, thinking maybe about broader aesthetic tensions created or unseen or unknown immediate tensions rather than necessarily being a kind of obvious binary conflict situation that might I might oversimplify or run the risk of doing that. And I've lost you for a second, sorry guys. And I think, often in the work that I did, it was interesting, the kind of misbehaving, or what I call the marvelous misbehaving, which is where there was such lovely deliciousness from participants getting to do the thing they wouldn't get to do in the real world, and they wanted to play into some of the darker stuff, and they wanted to know about some of the things that were not appropriate behaviors. And I'm curious about why that is and what questions they want to explore, and letting them do that, because it's the idea of that no penalty zone of drama that you would think is a great place to do that. Action, number 5 of the aha. So the physical resistance in the body, I think, is really interesting because it can be, it can be, you know, you don't necessarily know what a person is feeling or thinking by what outwardly appears, and they may be resisting inside. So, and, you know, that kind of fear of the body in schools very often, I think, is interesting too, that, you know, the movement of a person in space and occupying that space, and the body is the site of resistance. So I think, and in terms of also, I think, with the aesthetic and the idea of communicating in different ways, there's a lot of reliance, and sometimes in a drama I feel often, on talking about things, and actually sometimes it's about what's being held in the body or being demonstrated through the body or being communicated or expressed. And that can hopefully counteract, as I alluded to earlier, that very rational kind of paradigm of critical pedagogy has gotten locked into, and that Western political thought, and, you know, that subjugated kind of alternative visions of things, and that, you know, language needs to be, you know, unpacked and needs to be critiqued and questioned. And if we can think about the body as a space to do that, as both a private and a public space of kind of alternative knowings, it can give you a space in which, a tangible place to reflect and rebel. So, you know, the students in the drama that wanted to take a different stance, or, you know, do kind of peaceful rebellions, which is often relegated or ignored as being, oh, well, they're just having some fun. But actually, a lot of the time, that physical act that participants doing is very disruptive and, you know, and interesting. So what that means is keeping the work physical, drawing on those other knowledges, recognizing how vital the body is, and not only an individual body, but a body in community with other people. So how do they relate? How are they coming together? And assuming, I think, that if there are things that things are being understood, experienced, and communicated in the individual, within the body or between the bodies, that just because we don't necessarily understand or can articulate that into words doesn't mean it's not of value. Yeah, and as I said, in terms of what the students enjoyed, that doing was really, really vital. And then the last but not least of the aha is hope. So, you know, and this, I think, to boil it down, really is why we bother to do any of these things. So why are we working in the imagination? You know, in how can we challenge and question and disrupt and find space and cracks in the structures of the world if we don't have hope? It's absolutely essential. So needing to have a hopeful opposition to the dominant narrative, and that was very much enacted in some of the drama work, where participants really seized on the moments to play and kind of transgress and build on their previous experiences with imagination, with creative hope, giving them space to create something different, to create something critical, to decenter the world and offer an alternative path between, I guess, possible and impossible, as Freire would call it. So I think in terms of the critical process framework, it's got to be sustained by that hope that's coming in a resistance. It's got to fuel what's going on, because you've got to think, you know, as I always say to my teaching students, you know, when a student's got a lesson, you know, you're teaching a lesson, why do they care? It's the same thing, essentially. And that imaginary space can supply that imaginary, that expansive world for remaking it, and kind of foster that critical hope. So there needs to be something in the process work that hints at other things and alternatives, giving space to be creative in that. Participants need to feel that there is a place, there is a point to this, why they would bother, why, you know, that it's not a hopeless situation. And I very much think this is probably the trickiest one in some ways of those 6 elements of the framework to kind of nut out in terms of an individual work. So that's the framework. I've got this lovely slide here, which just kind of gives you all of them in there. And I use capoeira as my ultimate metaphor for that, because capoeira is a a dance form that, you know, was a controversial, rebellious, you know, rigorous kind of dance form that was regarded as dangerous, sort of was then misunderstood as kind of a dance thing, and it became a dance form, but it's still, you know, it's doing a lot of things under the, I guess, the guise of being just a bit of dancing. So it's it has a metaphor for that, in that it's very it keeps its participants physically and mentally strong for the rebellion, whilst doing it in a kind of aesthetic way, and in a way that was not so overt as to get anyone locked up. Okay, I've talked for ages. I'm going to carry on though, as I'm still here. Okay, so these are the things that I then thought in terms of actually trying to do it. Let's try to do the framework now. It's all theory, and I've got lots of thinking about that, but what's it actually like in the world with participants? So I have been doing this over the last few weeks in terms of working with the framework and with the existing process drama work, and kind of augmenting it and playing with it and trying things out. And these are the things I tried to kind of do with it. Make it episodic and not narrative and not linear. Think about the theatrical skills. Think about how I can use the aesthetic, the anti-naturalizing, not soap opera kind of stuff. Going in and out of the drama work, not just kind of staying in it for too long, keeping it active, keeping it moving, not too much talking heads, and that it has a hopeful space. So I used as my base kind of process drama work Wolves in the City, which is a picture book, and the process drama that's written on that is by Carol Miller and Juliana Saxton, and it's in Into the Story too. And I took that existing process drama and essentially went through it and looked at it through the lens of the framework, looked at the 6 elements of the framework and thought, okay, where is this here or not here? What can I add? What parts of this do I want to use? What would I change? What would I do? And then I had a go at it. So I basically started the drama work as I did 3, so I've done 3 workshops with this. And I start all of those things very much first. We're in circles, we're standing in a circle. I give my kind of, you know, I talk about very quickly, try to say, if anyone's uncomfortable at any stage, feel free to move out. I try to make it very invitational. I make it very clear this is exploratory work. And then I do some stuff with them where we just move with music. I join in with them. I try to keep myself kind of, as I said, soft eye, so I'm not staring at anyone when we're getting into this initial phase of the drama work. And then, yeah, so, you know, but all 3 I kind of started in the same vein in terms of that aspect. And then I worked through various things, various activities through the drama for about an hour and a half with each group. And yeah, and I'll just I guess quickly talk about what happened, and then I'd be very happy to take questions about it. So the first workshop, I was doing it with some teachers and some teacher educators with a very small group, and they talked too much was my first thing, and I allowed them to talk too much. So I gave them a piece of text to look at. The second activity where I gave them a piece of text to look at, and they were looking at it through different lenses. So I gave them kind of different, almost like the rewriting a role. I gave them a character to kind of look at that from that perspective. And then they had a discussion, and they just talked a lot. And it was that thing where, you know, when you're in dialogue and you're talking, everyone they started intellectualizing everything, and then they started, you know, bouncing their ideas off each other. But I worried that it was inhibiting people from saying necessarily what they wanted to say, because it was now in response to another person's offering. They were also very well behaved. They did all of the things I asked of them very nicely. The key activity they really enjoyed was where I had them play they created this very small little scene. This is in pairs. And then I played around with, you know, I said, now you have to play, can you play the scene, but can you stay in physical contact with your partner throughout the entire scene? And can you play the scene but use no words, just use gibberish sounds? Or can you play the scene but do opposite actions to the partner that you had? And so, yeah, it was interesting. That was the bit they enjoyed the most. And that, you know, in the short conversation we had afterwards, they were like, oh, that was, because I asked them finally to choose the one that felt the least comfortable, or choose what felt most comfortable in terms of how they played the scene, and then do the opposite. And they found that to be very interesting. And I went into role in that particular workshop as Ms. Rudensky and asked them to ask me 3 questions, which I really didn't feel worked. So the second time, so the things I decided I would change: less talking, or at least less communicating through words, just conversation, more doing. Think about what are people's personal responses as opposed to public sharing. Again, it was the idea that once they were starting to do stuff together, they were augmenting each other's responses. A bit more use of space and kind of quiet. And then I thought about doing a bit more around the narrative, because I think there was a real thing about where they wanted the story, or the opportunities that the story, or the questions they could ask. So I decided to bring in another drama convention in the next place. But what I found interesting about me working as a facilitator in that, because I went in as hot seating as Mr. Rudensky, and I asked him to ask me 3 questions, was it gave me far too much power over what happened or what I did and didn't do. And yeah, so that was quite, you know, an interesting kind of revelation in terms of agency, and trying to think about that aspect of the framework. I suddenly realized, oh, I could determine what I did or didn't answer to them, and I sort of held everybody's attention at that point and really had total charge over things. So I decided to do that differently in the next one. So the second time I did the workshop was a much larger group. And I think I upped the ante in terms of the aesthetic. I really worked to heighten the aesthetic aspects. We used what I called a polyphonic hot seat. So I had 3 of the participants who all went into role as the same character and were asked the same question. And that was a decision that the group made. And then in terms of their responses at the end of the workshop to feed back into a character, they did that privately. And I never, you know, I didn't ask them for any, to tell me anything about what they had said or how they'd felt about those things. So again, that was trying to stay away from the performative or giving me an answer that they thought I wanted. And yeah, it was interesting. Things I thought needed changing. I thought about trying to generate more data in role to try and make it more playful, because when I talked to the group afterwards, they were not sure how to talk about what we'd done. The scene play, this was a drama students, and they were very keen on the acting part. They got quite into their head about that. And in some way that made it didn't work as well, because they were so kind of wrapped up in getting their drama bit right. I thought about going into the Walls Have Ears drama conventions, where they stood around the room and tried to tell us from 10 years into the future, try to give us voiced what might have happened in that room as if they were the walls, which I thought was really, they really responded to, and I thought was really interesting, if a bit chaotic, and I thought, but again, I felt this time with this particular workshop, because I'd taken myself out of the teacher and role as hot seating, I wasn't really in this work as much. And I don't mean in as in telling them what to do or bossing it around, but just in terms of feeling collaborative with them. I felt a bit removed, and that kind of defaulted me into an authority position that I didn't like. So I was thinking about how to put myself in a more vulnerable spot. And I thought what I might do is go into that scene and just be the body in the room to hear those responses. Yeah, and just kind of have that visceral body in the space as well, and what it would be like if there was a live person. As it was, I used a pair of my shoes, so they had something in the, you know, as a symbol. But yeah, and then I was thinking about different ways of doing the final responding. So a collaborative something, or yeah, or coming up with a different way of feeding back into their reflection. So was that idea at the end of the workshop to reflect, not through talking, not necessarily something entirely private, but some kind of hybrid. And then in the final one that I've done, which was only 2 days ago, I had a very small number of participants. So I had to modify the plan quite a lot because of the size of the group. And I think I had more input in some ways because they were a small group and there was nowhere for me to kind of disappear into the numbers. What I did do with that was I used some of the writing that had been generated from the previous workshop to kind of supplement our understanding about this character. They weren't very interested in doing the scene section, and they really struggled with that, which was interesting as well. And I probably should have abandoned it in hindsight. But they asked some really amazing questions, and they were actually a really thoughtful group in the end. And it was very interesting to me, the dynamic about space and with having such a much smaller group and me, and how I felt much more collegial with them in lots of ways because we were a smaller group. So my fear there was because there was only a few of them, they would just, I could easily sort of take over and start and remove the agency from the group. But which I think was still a danger and probably still did happen in places. But I think as I said, it was a double-edged sword. They were a smaller group, which was interesting in that they felt more comfortable, I think, actually. But I felt much more like I'm having to perform, or was conscious of not performing. And even in that consciousness, obviously, I'm doing something different to what I would have done otherwise. So that's, I guess, where I'm at now. And my things I'm interested about in looking back on in terms of the data and things that were generated through those 3 workshops, although I'm not done yet, is what the questions that were asked, what questions the participants asked in the work and of the work, and then what questions I asked when I was facilitating it. Often questions I asked without rhetorical, questions I asked as provocations as opposed to questions I was expecting an answer to. So questions that I asked while we were doing activities, what motivated me to do those things? What did the participants respond to in terms of the activities and how they aligned with the framework? How, did it relate or resonate with them? And that's something I'm going to come back to them about. And then maybe thinking more about using some more drama as the research method as well, because as ever, I find talking about it isn't necessarily doing it justice. So that's where I am right now. If you're super interested, I've got a list here of some things I've written about it. And then I've got my contact information on the next slide if you want to ask me any later questions. But otherwise, I think I can hand back over to Anna, and I will,
Thank you for that fascinating
I went on, didn't I? Sorry, team.
Process had to be in the title, didn't it? But I'm actually going to bat over to Ali, who I think was going to manage the Q&A for this section now. So I'm here if you need me.
Okay.
I'll hand over to you, Alice.
Thank you very much, Claire, for that very thought-provoking presentation, and for the questions that you've asked of us as practitioners and scholars alike. Is there a question from the audience that anybody would like to ask at the moment? Feel free to pop it in the chat or to pop your hand up. And I'll just let everybody have a moment to see if there's a question that might come from our audience. And just while people are thinking about that, we'll perhaps, as we're running quite to time, thank you, Vanessa, for coming. Perhaps we could actually, Claire, refer people back to your extensive writing on this. The Create Centre will, of course, have this as a recording, and as part of the recording, Anna, I would imagine that there would be Claire's reference list and slides to be made available should anybody want to do some further questioning. And Claire, as part of that, I'm assuming that you would have your little card attached to that if anyone would like to ask some more questions. As people have said in the chat, thank you very much, Claire, we're running almost to time, Anna. And as there are no questions at the moment, I'd just like to again thank Claire for her generosity in sharing her research and work with us. And thank you for your stay with us too. And we look forward to seeing more of the more iterations of this particular work. So Anna, I think given that we haven't any specific questions at the minute,
we might run a little early unless
I think so.
Claire, might I just, I know everyone's dying to run off for dinner, but I was just thinking I could ask you, would you regard it as your ultimate goal to mediate the process as little as possible? Like, is your idea of when you get this system honed, it's going to involve you doing almost nothing in the room? Is that, or is that overstretching the idea?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think a lot more of it, it's evident to me a lot more of it is about sort of the, like, I would call it like cultivating the space. And so if you do that, I think you don't need to do as much, certainly. But it is also quite, I mean, I think as is evident from the three very different examples I had, like it is really contextual, and because it, as we were talking about, that kind of responsiveness to know when to come in and go out. And I think that's still something that's going to take me some time to nut out, is where you in or out, and how much to do that. But yeah, I don't know if not, I think there is something to do as a facilitator, but maybe it's not so overt, or it's so obvious, so obvious what you're doing. It's in the subtlety. I'm not sure that answers the question, but
No, absolutely, that's what I was wondering.
Thank you very much. And Claire, there are a number of people in the chat who've made comments to the effect that they'd like to be in touch with you and to do some further reading. So Anna, of course, curates that beautifully for us all, and those recordings and references will be available on our wonderful Create website. So
there
I guess
plenty of links under the video.
Plenty of links where we love a link at Create. Thank you very much, everybody, for your attendance. And thank you again, Claire, for your very generous and thoughtful presentation. Thank you, everybody, and good night.